Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're talking about networking and sociability, but not in the usual vague sense of telling you to put yourself out there and hoping you figure it out. Most networking advice usually begins in that sense with the result. It tells you to meet people and build professional relationships without exactly explaining how one ordinary conversation is supposed to develop into anything meaningful. That missing process can make networking look like a natural talent that some people have and others don't. When in reality, people who seem comfortable networking have learned how to move through those interactions. They know how to enter a conversation without forcing it, recognize whether the person wants to continue, and leave enough context for a future interaction. Those are social decisions, and that can be practiced without necessarily changing your entire personality. So, to get started and make this process easier, we first need to understand why networking can feel so gosh darn uncomfortable in the first place. So, the moment you think someone might help you get a job, the conversation usually can stop feeling normal. Okay, you are no longer simply meeting a person in your mind, you are trying to protect a possible opportunity that does not even exist yet. That pressure changes how you behave. You may agree too quickly, force your experience into the conversation, or search for just the right moment to mention that you're looking for work. Now, the other person on the other side of this may kind of feel a pressure as a result of that, even if you never really directly ask them for anything. A better approach and a more healthy way to kind of keep this from feeling fake is to give the conversation a smaller purpose, to try to leave understanding one useful part of the person's experience and try to build on that relationship over time. You are not hiding your professional goals in this sense. You are just accepting that this one person does not need to solve all of them. That can make the interaction feel more human, but you still have to overcome with what a lot of people struggle with, which is when your brain tells you to not approach it all. So you cannot predict how somebody is going to respond. Okay. Your mind often kind of fills in the blanks of that with literally the most uncomfortable possibility. You might imagine interrupting them, running out of things to say, or realizing that they have no interest in speaking with you. Now, avoiding the conversation, that usually brings immediate relief, okay, which can make avoidance feel like this naturally correct decision. However, the problem is that when you do that, you are not collecting anything new. You do not get to learn that the person might have acted normally, that the conversation could have lasted longer than 2 minutes, or that a slightly awkward opening would have not mattered. The way out of all of that is to make success seem smaller. And what I mean by that is that success is not getting someone's contact information or just inherently making them like you. It's about giving them a respectful opening and allowing them to decide whether they want to continue. If they engage, you have something to work with. If they do not, you can leave without really treating it like a personal failure because it's not your fault. Sometimes people just aren't in the mood for it or they have too much on their plate to be a mentor or whatever. So you just got to work with what you got. And starting and actually getting involved in this stuff solves the imagined version of the conversation. So once you're actually talking, you can kind of work through the current anxiety of what do I do and what do I say, which is what we're going to talk about in our next slide. Now, a conversation can feel very different from inside your own head, okay? You can feel yourself searching for a word, so a short pause can seem enormous. You know when an answer came out differently, maybe, than what you might have intended. So you kind of assume all of these mistakes become the epicenters of the interaction. However, in reality, right? The other person doesn't necessarily have access to that internal commentary. They usually see a much simpler version of events. You thought for a moment, answered, and continued. Meanwhile, they may be thinking about how they sounded or what they should be saying next. This is why you should kind of judge the interaction by what the other person is doing, not by how nervous you feel. If they continue adding information and responding to what you say, the conversation is still moving. You are good to go. Now, if they close the exchange or start kind of pulling back a little bit, you can respect that without deciding that you embarrassed yourself. Now, you do not need to feel completely confident before speaking. You just need something more useful to focus on than your own performance. And I'm going to kind of give you some leads as to how that works. So, trying to impress someone keeps part of your attention pointed back at yourself. So, while they are speaking, you are kind of in this mode where you're preparing for your next answer or deciding whether your last one sounded intelligent enough. That actually makes it harder to notice the details that could actually continue your conversation. So, give your attention one simple job: understand something. If I meet someone, for instance, who works in identity and access management, I do not need to prove how much security terminology I know. I could try to understand what led them into the work. You know, their answer may in some ways connect to something I've experienced in IT support, which kind of would give me, or if you were in this situation, a natural way to respond without necessarily forcing my resume into the conversation. This is how curiosity makes communication easier. You stop searching for the perfect thing to say and you start responding to what is directly in front of you. Adaptation at its finest. So, after you kind of figure all that out, the next step is just learning how to begin that exchange. And the easiest opening usually comes from the situation you already share. Now, what does that mean? So, the situation around you can usually do most of the work starting the conversation. If you are both attending the same presentation, you already have something to talk about. You do not need a random opening or an immediate question about their career. You could say something literally as simple as, "That point about access problems really caught my attention in that presentation. Is that something you deal with in your work a lot?" That feels natural because it came from something both of you just experienced. It also gives the person a clear place to begin answering. You are not asking them to produce an interesting conversation with you, you are giving them one specific idea to respond to. Once they answer, the conversation doesn't necessarily need a new topic. You just have to organize what your next response is, and usually that's going to be somewhere inside of what they just said back to you. Now, what do I mean by that? Conversations often kind of become awkward in a lot of different ways, mostly because we are searching for the next question instead of listening to what the current one answers, kind of like how I was hinting at before. Basically, when you're not listening, it kind of creates a series of disconnected topics where it ends up kind of feeling like neither person is really fully understood. So, what you're going to do is imagine, in this case, the person tells me they moved into identity and access management, after seeing repeated account problems and technical support. I could jump to another prepared question, or I could stay with what they gave me and ask, was there a particular problem that made you want to work on that side of things? You want to explain that a little bit more? When I do that, they now know that I was listening. I am helping them continue a thought they had already chose to share instead of asking them to start over with a new subject. This also removes some of the pressure to plan ahead. You do not need a complete conversation prepared in your mind because their answer is going to be what helps you get to your next response. So, if you only ask questions though, the interaction can kind of begin to feel like this weird interview, okay? The other person also needs to understand why the subject matters to you. So, in a lot of ways, you're kind of balancing this thing where, yes, you're questioning them, you're giving them this response, and you're trying to work within the confines of what they have kind of given back to you. But you also need to work on offering up a little bit of yourself in a way that's not, I want to say offensive, but it's not offensive. It's more like in your face. So we're going to kind of talk about that in the next slide. So you can give context by just connecting a small part of your experience to what they just said. If they explain that technical support led them towards identity work, I could say something as simple as, that is actually why I asked. I work in IT support now, and access problems are actually one of the things, that's pulling my attention towards security as of late. So I'm kind of thinking about doing that as a more towards my career. That all of that is enough to help them understand me or you without turning the conversation into a complete professional history. I, in this context, am not trying to compete with their experience or redirect every subject back to myself. I'm showing them why I understood their point and why I wanted to hear more. Now, a conversation kind of becomes easier when both people have enough context to understand where each other are kind of coming from, but that context also determines whether they can remember each other later. So, People usually do not remember every detail of an introduction, okay? They remember the part that gave the person a clear place in their mind. If I only say that I work in IT and want to enter cybersecurity, the other person may understand me in the moment, but they have nothing necessarily specific to connect with me later. If I explain more specifically that I work in university IT support and I am exploring identity work because of the access problems that I keep seeing, they now have a clear picture of where I am and where I'm actually trying to go. That gives them a reason to think of me if they hear about a related workshop, resource, or person. I don't need to recite my resume, neither do you. All we got to do is just leave on one clear professional thread. So, once that thread exists, the conversation should end in a way that makes it reusable again. How do we go about doing that? I'm about to show you. So, exchanging contact information does not automatically continue a conversation. Okay. If neither person really remembers why they connected, the new contact usually becomes just another name sitting in your docket. All right. So before leaving, bring back something specific that kind of came up between you. I might say something like, I'm going to look into the access review resource that you mentioned. Would you mind if I connected with you and kind of let you know how that goes? Now a future message will have context, right? So the person knows who I am, why I'm reaching out, and what happened because of their advice. Only create that reason if you really intend to follow through, okay? So, because after the conversation, they're going to want to save enough context that you can kind of keep the promise of whatever it is that you wanted to interact with about the next time without necessarily trying to fully recreate that interaction later. Now, at that point, you kind of have done more than collect a contact. You have created the possibility of another meaningful interaction. Turning that possibility into a relationship depends on what happens next. So, as I was saying before, one good conversation is not necessarily enough to know whether anyone can trust you professionally. They may enjoy speaking with you, but they don't have enough evidence to really have a gauge of who you are and how you behave over time. That evidence and all of that stuff is kind of built through small repeated interactions. You remember something they told you, return when you said you would, or complete a small thing that you kind of offered to do. Each interaction gives the person a little bit more information about you. This is why professional relationships usually develop more naturally when people share a reoccurring space. That's because it's kind of like neither person really has to force the entire relationship into one thing. They can become familiar gradually over time and decide more about whether there is enough trust there to share advice, collaborate, or kind of make introductions to other people. The question in this for us then kind of becomes, where can you find environments that make those repeated interactions possible? That's where we get to here. Now, a single network event can kind of place too much pressure on one evening. You may feel that you have to meet the right person immediately that night because you do not know whether you'll see anyone here ever again. That is why I don't really like one offs. I personally prefer reoccurring groups because it removes some of that pressure. Instead of searching only for networking events, search for places where people regularly do something to connect to the field. A cybersecurity study group, professional chapter, or community service project kind of gives people just this reason to return beyond exchanging contact information. Now, before attending, kind of check whether the group is actually active, look for a recent event, and any other evidence that you might find that something else might be planned in the future. You also kind of want to find a way to participate. A smaller group with regular activity may give you more opportunity to become known than a large group where everyone kind of remains a little bit of a stranger. So, once you find a promising group, the goal is not to walk in and immediately become important, it's to become familiar. And what does that mean? Basically, when you first visit, it's going to be mainly about understanding your environment. Notice how people interact when conversations normally happen and whether newcomers are more or less welcomed. Introducing yourself to one person is going to be the start of that, and it's going to give you enough to give a starting point, basically. Now, when you return later on, continue something from that previous visit. If somebody mentions studying for a certification or working on a project, Walk up to them, ask them how it's going. That small act changes you from a stranger into somebody who can be remembered. So as you become more comfortable, find a manageable way to then at that point start contributing. That could mean helping with part of an event or sharing something that directly supports a conversation. The contribution itself doesn't necessarily need to be super important or impressive. Okay, it just needs to be useful and small enough that you can kind of follow through on it in a timely manner that doesn't hurt yourself or the other person. That is just how you become part of a group. People stop knowing you only by your introduction and they begin knowing you through your behavior and your work. The same idea should guide what you send after meeting someone. So, a good follow up kind of continues the original conversation instead of starting over with a generic message. If someone recommended that I learn more about access reviews, I could write, "Hey, I looked into the access review process that you mentioned and finally understand why it's so important in identity work. Thank you for giving me a better place to begin." That message shows that I remembered the advice and did something with it. The other person at this point can then see that their time had an effect, which makes that message more meaningful than simply saying it was nice to meet them. You do not need to create constant conversation though. Reach out when you have a relevant update or a genuine reason to connect. If the person does not respond, allow the relationship to remain where it is instead of trying to repeatedly chase a reply. You can also use this approach with people you already know, including those you have not necessarily spoken to recently. All right. So many people kind of assume that networking means meeting complete strangers. Okay. But your current contacts may already connect you to parts of the professional world that you can't necessarily see. So, someone you might have worked with or met through school may now currently have experience, information, or relationships that they didn't necessarily have when you knew them more closely. Reconnecting should begin with the actual relationship itself, okay, not an immediate request. Acknowledge where you know them from, show genuine interest in what they're doing now, and kind of explain what has changed for you. If an introduction would help, make the request narrow, okay? Instead of asking whether they know anyone who can get you a cybersecurity or IT job, explain that you are currently, I don't know, exploring identity work and would value a short conversation with somebody who understands the field. Make it clear that they can decline if nobody appropriate really comes to mind, because that makes the decision easier, mostly because they start to understand, who you are hoping to meet and kind of why. Now, you're going to be asking them to create a conversation, not guarantee an opportunity or make promises about skills that they have not personally seen. If they introduce you, treat the new person's time carefully and thank the original contact afterward. That is how one relationship that you already have can lead into another without necessarily turning either person into like a transaction. So, ultimately, networking is just about convincing as many people as you can that you're a decent person. That's really all it is. It's not about giving relationship it's not about pressuring relationships or trying to make people feel that like, you know, I am the only solution to your problems. It's about being a human being. It's about walking up to somebody and being like, "Hey, I'm interested in this. I'm interested in this. And, this is really interesting that you do. And I would love to learn more about that." Because when you're interacting with someone and you're trying to build a professional relationship with them, especially someone higher than you need to treat that like an ideal mentorship. Only approach people you are genuinely interested in, because if you are not approaching somebody for the right reasons, they're immediately going to sense that. They are immediately going to feel that feeling that everyone gets when someone walks up to them and starts asking for stuff, especially people who don't know you asking for stuff. Everybody knows how they feel about that. It sucks. It's weird. So if you kind of learned a lot from this presentation and you want to see more stuff like this, please let me know. The presentation will be linked in the description on YouTube, and if you're in TikTok, in the comments below, you just got to copy paste into the internet. Now, if you're interested in any of these topics up here, please let me know in the comments just so that I can kind of prepare my next presentation, because I think that there's a lot of merit in doing some more career based videos these days just because everybody's struggling so hard, and we need to level up our game if we want to get into the spaces to make the changes that we know we need to make in order to make all of this system work for everybody. And that's what I truly, truly, honestly believe. I mean, if you go into my resume video, I talk a little bit about that at the end, saying, AI isn't where it should be right now. It's, ecologically unsafe. It's, bad for people. It's hurting the economy. But if we take advantage of the resource and we use it to set the ship right, then all of that suffering and stuff that happens is kind of, it ends up being for a better reason. Because you never want suffering to just be a net negative, ever. You don't want to suffer for nothing. So let's put our paws together, put our brains together, and get out there, get these jobs, make the world a better place, and please follow for more practical career advice and cybersecurity guidance, and I will see you in the next one.